So I wanted to start, and we have plenty of time for questions and discussion, but I wanted to start by just inviting Ava and Kat to, if they have any responses to each other's presentations or questions for each other about, their own practices, and then we can open out into a larger discussion. I also have some questions for the two of you, but wanted to open it up for both of you first.
I'm still thinking.
Okay. Well, then I will pose a question that is something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of my own teaching and pedagogy, but was also something that I felt kind of like connection between what the two of you are doing and thinking about teaching as well, which is the kind of like emotional work and emotional engagement that we have with our students and as trans people in the classroom. And so I guess I was wondering if like both of you could speak to, the way that, clearly all of us are teaching kind of heavy stuff, but we're also teaching students who are themselves dealing with, current, despair, frustration, anger, who are maybe resistant to thinking about joy, who often don't have support from other faculty, who maybe have a little bit of support from other places in the university, but often kind of come to us as the trans elder in their lives, a thing my students literally call me. So I guess there's, I think, that question of how do you support students while also supporting yourselves, and how do you so Kat, I was particularly thinking about this in the context of your own students' binary readings of these pieces. I'm looking at you as though you can see me from this screen, and I realize that actually I should be looking that way.
Don't worry, Beans, I'm everywhere.
Yes, you and the panoptic owl. Right, and so you're encountering these students who are reading these pieces in a really binary way, and at least like my experience when my own, students are maybe unintentionally saying something that is like painful to me, but then having to kind of squash that down in order to have it be, a teachable moment, as it were. So that's a kind of a long, rambly question about like, how do both of you engage with your own emotional reactions to the stuff that happens in your classrooms with your students?
Do you want to cue one of us to go first? I have trouble reading the room and the vibes from within a small owl.
That's fair. Even though you have eyes in the back of your head, I guess, that's a lot to deal with. Do either of you have immediate thoughts? I can cold call someone, but.
I'm glad to take that. But
cool. Yeah, go for it.
All right. One of the things that there's probably a lot of things that are unusual about each of us, but one of the things that that might make me slightly peculiar is I find that moments like that in the room create really exciting opportunities for teaching, and I really want to honor and make space for the experience of finding that painful, while also saying that I personally find those moments a little bit exciting. From a pedagogical standpoint, because the moments in which someone might find an articulation of a binary gender painful is going to happen as frequently as, but might be noticed less frequently than a moment in which another kind of microaggression or structural violence occurs in the classroom, but is not noticed, right, by whoever is leading the discussion. And so I get really excited about these moments in which like to which I am particularly attuned, because I think it gives an opportunity to make space for or encourage students to say things that or attend to moments or things that are said that can sort of have an opportunity for improvement and learning built into that. And one of the things that I've noticed in my particularly in my classes that are queer and trans studies, like labeled, as opposed to the class that I'm teaching this semester, which is called Art and Its Histories, which is basically a feminist, queer, trans, black, indigenous, and disability art class that is masquerading as an introductory art history course. You know, I'll have a lot of students who will come in and want to learn how to speak in a way that is more generative and more operative, and not know how to ask to do that. And so, you know, I think I don't know, I see those as kind of exciting teachable moments, but there's also, I'll, you know, caveat that with there being something very wrong with me, and that being probably one of those things.
Yeah, I feel like I have answers at like different levels. I think that there are some, like to answer the first part of your question, I think that like there are interesting moments of identification with me from certain folks in the room that happen a lot in like office hours and outside of the classroom. And I think I'm pretty loath to share personal information. So I really treat that more like a text, at least if it's a teachable moment. Like if there are like immediate needs and resources, like I will accommodate and find out what to do. But if it's brought into the classroom, I think that like, yeah, similar to Kat, like I think that there's usually some sort of opportunity to kind of articulate what sort of transphobia is happening, but moving really beyond that framework, and really thinking a bit more deeply, or like trying to come up collectively with a language for what that violence or aggression or whatever it is beyond saying like, well, clearly that person's just transphobic, or like, you know, not that people can't make those statements, but there's not much for us to work with when that's the case. And so usually that's sort of like a collective process. I think the flip side of the question also that I've experienced a lot is actually students really like disidentifying with a text or being really resistant and saying like, you know, this feels inauthentic, or especially from academic texts, right? Or like, you know, oh, this person is like out of touch or doesn't understand trans identity now. And it's true that like lots of my like Gen Z students are like teaching me terms that like I don't know, and like new things all the time. But I feel like those moments are actually even bigger because we're able to sort of unpack what's at stake in authenticity, in trans circles, in trans pain, in what qualifies as a trans experience. And I kind of gestured to that at the end of my talk, but it's interesting to me, this sort of like ownership that people feel over trans narratives in the US or ones that they are racially identified with. And while like that sort of collectivity can be really important, I think in the classroom it's like more important to sort of denaturalize that connection a bit, to come up with something different and like come up with a different mode of understanding the world. Like you see this gap especially with like trans generations, like an older trans folks describing their lives in certain ways. I've encountered like a lot of resistance from my students towards the way that that's talked about. So yeah, but similar. I think there's something to be discussed, like what's at stake in that authenticity. Why do you want why do you believe a trans narrative should be this way, or or an identity should have these boundaries around it? And there's not necessarily something wrong with that either, too. But I think just the exercise of articulating what those boundaries are and why you have them is so huge, so huge. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So we have plenty of time for questions from you all. Do we have a mic that we'll hand around? Okay. So yeah, questions, thoughts? Yes, Jonathan.
I wanted to talk about intersectionality, because one of the things that's really striking, especially in the case of Argentina, as you doubtless know, is that it was largely indigenous folk who were at the forefront of the early trans movement in Argentina, in part because the cultural norms did not necessarily specify a kind of binary gendered system. And is there a way then in your pedagogy to sort of fold all of this together and to take students outside of their familiar binary gender frame through reference to other cultural formations?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jonathan. Yes, and it's tricky because I feel like the framework that's holding all of this sort of global, and I use that word hesitantly, trans politics together, is this sort of emergent visibility around gender nonconformity and transness, and that term is getting adopted in a lot of places, or people are having to respond to it. So like in the Argentina example that you're giving, like travesti is like a racialized non-binary gender, and all the travesti activists that are a part of that movement and that I've talked to are very resistant and saying, like, we are not transgender, but we understand that there is a new generation of people who identify as either transgender or non-binary in Argentina because that visibility has changed so much, and we work in solidarity with them, but there is a generational divide. So it's similar to, the conversation is already there, I think, from people that you're talking about, whether it's indigenous folks, whether it's Bakla folks in the Philippines, and also especially across all of these nations, older generations of gender nonconforming people are already having to respond to it. So I think the conversation is there and brings students into it, and understanding what's at stake in that rejection of that term or that embodiment is helpful. And also, like, kind of to what Kat was talking about, you know, it denaturalizes that gaze and also offers like a sort of set of tools for people to think of gender as much more flexible. Like travesti makes no distinction between gender and sexuality. That's not, even though that's a useful framework for us sometimes in the US for explaining, like that distinction does not exist. And it's about how you're read. It's about how you're read and how you move about your day. And when you don't have a claim to an identity and it's in another nation, I feel like, I don't know, in my experience, students have been more open to that sort of discussion of what are these different tenets and how are they getting changed out in different places. So, yeah, thanks.
Question in back corner.
Hi, thank you both, all three of you, for being here. My research focuses on queer elders and the capacity to mitigate harm for young people, queer and trans young people. And I'm curious, to your point, a number of you have mentioned kind of generations and this bidirectional learning that can happen between, you know, non-biological kin, I guess. Like these like trans elders. I'm curious how you have facilitated those kinds of discussions, either through objects and archives or through lived experience, and secondarily, what lessons folks who have been circumnavigating systems for longer than some of Gen Z has been alive, like how can we leverage these experiences and strategies to mitigate some of that despair, given the anti-trans hellscape that we're currently living in.
Kat, do you want to go first? I feel like I just talked, so.
Yeah, totally, sure. I mean, this might not be a long respite for you, Eva, unfortunately, but so I do teach object-based learning. That's the focus of my research. I've been trained extremely well in that regard. But I don't really work in a way that facilitates conversations across generations, perhaps in the precise way that you're asking about. And and I think one of the things that we might attend to is, there's a way in which generationality can really be attended to with care in a productive way, but also a way in which thinking generationally can also sort of stymie other kinds of connections. And one of the things that I think we might attend to as a sort of example of that framework in practice is the degree to which we are. I really appreciate your phrasing of living in an anti-trans hellscape, but it's not a new condition. It's just where we've been living this entire time. And so I think one of the things that we can do if we sort of trouble a little bit the linearity of generationality, if we sort of trans or queer generational divides through attention to trans and queer kinning practices, is to understand the ways in which, and this is a fundamentally Benjaminian concept, right? The ways in which there is no such thing as this new condition in which we're living that is deeply transphobic and violent. It's we've been here this entire time. It's just that the transphobia or whatever manifestation of violence that we're talking about keeps taking new forms. And when we think it's receded a little bit, it's just shape-shifting. And so, I think that's one thing that we can attend to that can also help us sort of build understanding among people of different ages. I guess that's the end of my comments for that.
Thanks, Kat, for going first. And thanks for those questions. I think about this a lot, and I'm still struggling through it. But just because I think there's a really intentional, structural violence or forces that are separating trans generations very much on purpose, and it's really difficult to bridge that gap, I think, sometimes. So there's a number of ways that I think I approach it. This sounds, okay, this is back to basics and very much in my department, but from the first week, we do a lot of generous reading, that whole, some people have probably heard this, the whole say yes to the text 3 times, yes to reading the text, yes to, what is it? Yes to being able to recapitulate the argument, yes to extending it as far as it can go. These are teachings from Gayatri Spivak. But reiterating that practice through a bunch of texts that students disagree with, and sometimes are hostile towards students, actually, is difficult, but has been helpful for me. So an example would be all the recent discussion. I mean, I hate the conversation, but all the discussion with T.S. Madison responding to that, I'm not sure if people are familiar with this British trans woman who was harassed going into a bathroom. And there was a lot of discussion online, people being yeah, but you are making no effort in appearing like a trans woman. And that was a really difficult conversation, but one where I was we will totally jump into criticisms. There's a lot, but if you were to read this generously and try to understand why she would say that, this is a figure that you typically trust on their politics. So why would she say that about this person? What's going on? What are the scripts that she's relying on to get there? And is really helpful and really forces people to strain themselves. And I disagree with the statement too, but I understand where it's coming from, and I understand why there's a generational divide there, and also why there's a racial divide there as well. Or I've taught Jack Halberstam's really short piece on trans memory and generations, and found that students are really resistant to it. And they're like, this feels like, this old guy's mad at us. Why is he mad at us? And I'm like, why is he mad at you? You know what I mean? Like, let's talk about it. Like, that's actually a useful question, and we can go from there. And my goal is not necessarily to have students like agree with the argument or be like, oh, totally. But it is to be like, okay, what are the forces leading this person to have that sort of affective response in writing, and why would they respond to a new generation of trans children in this way, right? And then there's also all the texts on trans children, right? Like, I think Jules Gill Peterson's work is phenomenal. I think that book is amazing and really demonstrates that trans children are not new, and why the focus on children is about, trying to remove political agency from a much larger group, from a people that are already unprotected. So, but I try not to start immediately with children, because I think that's like, there's so much of it present already. So I'd rather start with these sort of generous readings of like trans elders and be like, yeah, what is this emotional thing we're talking about?
Other questions? Or if you have a comment rather than a question, there's space for that as well. Yes.
Thank you, both of you, for the excellent and very thought-provoking presentations. My name is Patrick. I'm a PhD student here in East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And I was actually just thinking about language, right? And I think a lot of the conversation has been a little bit about that. And I were talking about the word travesti, right? And how it has a certain connotation, right? In Spanish versus English, made me start thinking more about translation itself and how often we are teaching. This is one I would say is for both of you, but with a slightly different valence, perhaps. But essentially, right, this question of sometimes, and I'll just say like for Ava, I generally am teaching students who do not speak Japanese, and so you have certain terms, right? Like, for example, the term in English for gender identity disorder, which is not really used in English anymore, GID, is still used fairly frequently, and there are certain terms that directly translate to a dressing as a woman or dressing as a man for what are often in parallel to transgender identities, even within a Japanese discursive context, right? And so I often wonder, should I not translate those? Should I offer some sort of kind of provisional translation? Or should we have more of a discussion about that, right? And I guess the other one I would say for Kat is, because you're working on stuff from the 70s, right? I often also encounter sometimes language that students have resistance to, right? It's kind of inappropriate in the current text. So if you ever have kind of antiquated language in the way that some of the artists and people that you are present their gender identities, how do you kind of bridge that gap when students have a resistance? I guess that's the question, right? Tricky language, both in translation from other languages and from the past.
Kat, how you feeling? You want me to go or you want to go?
I can go.
Okay.
I mean, unless you want to jump in first, go for it.
No, you got it.
All right, cool. So thanks for your question. I really appreciate that. It's super interesting. I guess I have responses to both parts in some way. One of them is that you're talking about students not speaking Japanese, I think, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
But, and I'm not familiar with the Japanese language, but I do have facility in a couple of others, including German. And the contemporary practice for they, them pronouns in German, which is a highly gendered language, like all of the verb constructions, the sort of case situation makes a lot of things super gendered. But one of the ways that Germans are getting around it is that they are literally using the English language words they and them in the middle of their sentences. So for example, like, ich habe heute mit Kat gesprochen und they hat gesagt. I have today spoken with Kat, and they said, and they literally use the English word they. So I think one of the ways that at least I've introduced when I'm thinking translationally in English, Spanish, and French, or sorry, in Spanish, French, and German, is to look at the practices in those languages today and talk to students about how those practices are being dealt with in the language in its contemporary usage. And I think that often helps students sort of figure out their way, or helps a class figure out a way together to talk about these. And then the other thing is, we're living in this moment in which things are changing very rapidly, like language is changing very rapidly, and I think that students can, to some degree, be, we've, a lot of Ava, as well as people raising questions, and Beans and so on, have raised moments in which students are or can be resistant to a range of things based on their experiences that may really dramatically differ from what has happened in the past. And I think that, historical specificity is really important to me. I think that just because something is not now how it used to be, and it used to be something that someone views as problematic, is not an excuse for studying it and understanding it in its moment. And so I think that really helping students understand the importance of historical specificity, whether we're talking about something related to trans identity or not, is really key. And I think helping students understand the ways in which language have changed over time, what was imagined as, what was imagined 100 years ago as really cutting edge, out of the box, risky, or dangerous, that might seem today, by today's standards, rather conservative, is I think a helpful. I think just anchoring things in their historical moment is a really, really helpful pedagogical tool in this and other ways. And if we apply that practice consistently throughout our classes, throughout the materials we're doing, not just to moments in which trans questions arise, then it helps, I think, acclimate students to the import of it. But I'm speaking as a I'll emphasize the word art, but art historian. So that may be just me.
Yeah, I think that among the options that you gave, I feel like my answer is just yes. Many of these things are untranslatable, and that doesn't mean I don't think we should try. So I feel like I am teaching students translation work, and some of these debates around what Kat was talking about. Originally in this presentation, I had one of those Stuart Hall quotes that's let go of your attachment to language, stay attached to the concept. And I feel that. So I feel like I'm often explaining the battles around things like Bakla, or, especially in Southeast Asia, there's just a huge, there's a plethora of words that just don't translate, and people have written entire monographs on trying. And I think that's a worthwhile exercise, but really it's about what's being staked out through language in that fight against a sort of US or Western notion of transgender. And again, like I was saying before, people are staging that conversation a lot because it's appearing everywhere now, and people are having to get funding for NGOs by using the term transgender. And so I feel like that battle is far more important to me than getting lost in the language. But I've gotten in fights over that or people have been very upset about my quick translations. So I understand why that's important too.
And I think we have time for one more quick question. Yes, in the back.
Perfect. So I'm still an undergrad, so I am asking this also partly from a student perspective because I'm not teaching anyone yet. But I think I picked this up a little bit in your presentation, Ava. I'm just curious, to what extent is it problematic or harmful for students to center themselves in these classrooms, and how do you balance that with the fact that so much identity exploration and formation happens in the classrooms too, which has been like my experience.
Yeah, thanks for that. What a great question. I mean, I don't think it's problematic at all, and I think we're doing it constantly, whether we name it or not. The sort of exploration of self and embodied experience, and I am trying to invite it, and it is like, you know, I think the reason I start with Professor Snorton's piece and Kim Awkward-Rich's piece is because it's showing like a method for how to think through your body and like the way that you're being read in the world and how to navigate that. And I think of that as a model, even if it doesn't align for, you know, like other students in my classroom. But that like, so much of that comparative analysis helps defamiliarize things for myself. For me personally, right? Like learning about these other contexts where I'm like, oh, like there's this US thing that I felt kind of instinctually I was resistant to, but like it's really a US narrative of like transition, that like you're assigned this at birth, and then, you know, and seeing that exerted in other places, and I think that's a good thing. And so like, you know, I keep saying decenter and like moving outside the US, and that's true, but I think that that's still with the like, still knowing that you are understanding your experience and processing it as you learn about other people and other places. So, yeah, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much to Ava and Kat.